Is economic recovery in the wake of a global pandemic. You know which global pandemic we're talking about. My name's Tim Phillipson. For the next 60 minutes, we're going to be broadcasting to you on Zoom and on Facebook Live. And our question today, what will the recovery from COVID-19 be like in different places? And what are the possible paths and pitfalls for that recovery? So for the next 60 minutes, we have a suitably global panel. So I'd like to introduce them first of all, Elena Carletti of Bocconi University, and she's going to be speaking about the situation in Europe. Elena, welcome.
Thank you.
And joining us from Chicago Booth Business School, Randy Kroszner, who will be looking at the United States. Hello, Randy.
Hello, although I'm joining you from London. But with Chicago Booth.
It's an outpost of Chicago. It is, yes. And from the Bank of International Settlements, Hyun Shin is going to be talking to us about Asia. Hyun, hello.
Hello, Tim. Greetings from Basel.
Now, to avoid this being a webinar about everything, we have asked each speaker to give a brief overview of the situation in their region and then to focus on the biggest challenge that they see in the process of recovery. Now, I'll leave them to tell you what that is. As the audience, though, you do not have the same restrictions. It's not a webinar if you don't ask questions, so use the little Q&A tab at the bottom there. If you go there and you find that your question's already been asked or you see a particularly good question, then why not upvote it and it comes to the top of the pile? And that means that we see it quicker. But before we get into any of that, first of all, I would like to introduce the president of the CEPR, Beatriz Veda Di Mauro, and she's going to introduce our session. Beatriz, welcome. I bet you're probably pleased that you're not doing the panel for once.
Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you very much to all these fantastic speakers that we have on the panel. And so, you know, just to complete the scene in terms of the global is, CEPR London, but I'm actually the only one right now based in Asia and talking to you and reaching you from Singapore. And in some ways, what we are doing today is, in a way, a special edition. It is special because of the quality of the speakers that we have here, because of the breadth of the topic that we are addressing, 3 continents. It's also, of course, in the Northern Hemisphere, a little bit the fact that we are kind of winding down a little bit for the summer, hoping that there is going to be some kind of relief after this big effort that was made in many countries to get on top of this big disease, of this crisis in economic terms and in medical terms. And so you know, when I look across these different regions, certainly from Asia, as I look from my perspective of Asia, I can see both the first wave here. It actually did start in Asia. It was relatively contained in Asia, but then right now in Singapore, we are already at the end of a second wave. And when I look at Europe, where, you know, CEPR and all of Europe have been in lockdown for many months, and where in CEPR, while in lockdown, we were really in acceleration mode at the same time, but clearly in an extraordinary situation. But then Europe is now opening up, not only opening up to movement within countries, but also across countries. And as I already said, many people are hoping that there is going to be some relief and some holiday mood. In fact, a lot of holiday mood already seems to be around when I see what is going on around Europe. And then we look at the US, and in the US, whether we call it second wave or whatever we call it, but definitely the situation doesn't seem to be very comfortable. And so just across those 3 regions, we have such a variety of experiences, which all suggest this whole problem is not over. it's still with us. And, you know, from the point of view of CEPR, the pandemic, the response to it, the huge economic questions that are being asked everywhere have really meant that we have completely refocused CEPR over the last 3 months and put the whole network, all of its power, in the service of both the profession and the policymakers, with the intention to try and help understand and try and provide guidance wherever possible, and you know, alleviate wherever possible. I see this panel very much in the breadth of this initiative and of this intention. I thank very much the excellent speakers one more time, and I'm really looking forward to your discussions, your views, and I wish all of us after this a bit of a break, a bit of a summer holiday, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Beatrice. I'm going to be spending my summer holiday on Zoom this year. Okay, so over to our panel. First of all, I'd like to introduce Elena, who's going to be talking about Europe. Elena, the floor's yours.
Thank you, Beatrice and team, for the nice introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. I'm actually delighted to be here. I realize I'm the only one who doesn't have a background, let's say, a business background, and I'm actually the one joining you from the seaside. So after months spent in Milano and in strict lockdown, as you can imagine, given the situation in the region, we thought of moving to the seaside, and somehow we immediately cheer up, because here it looks as if nothing has ever happened. So there was not a single case and people are very relaxed. So on the one end, it's a positive mood and maybe a good hope for the recovery, which we will discuss in a minute. So actually, in these minutes of introductory remark, I would like to just tell you a little bit what has happened in Europe and where we are in terms of GDP impact of the crisis. Very briefly, what the policies have been that have been taking place, but most of all, what I think are the main challenges for the recovery. So let me start with the first one, the impact of the crisis. So according to the most recent forecasts, if we take, for example, the ECB forecast for the Euro area, the Bank of England, or the IMF, the impact of the crisis in 2020 is currently estimated between a reduction of about 8.7 to 10.2. And in 21, instead, it's forecast a recovery between 5.2 and 6%, and then about 3.3 in 22. So if you can see from these numbers, we are seeing a sharp reduction this year, a moderate increase next year, actually a rather, I would say, significant increase next year, but overall 2 years to recover fully to the pre-crisis level. And with these numbers of GDP, we would see then the employment raised to about 10% and stay there almost for the 3 years to come, I mean, until 2022, maybe with a slight reduction at that point. So let me say, although these numbers are quite substantial, and we see already the big impact that the crisis had on Europe, it's fair to say that they are surrounded by big uncertainty still. And why? A little bit because the uncertainty comes from how the pandemic will evolve. We are now, at least in Italy, very relaxed and very optimistic, but we know, as Beatrice was already saying, we may have a second wave coming forward. We don't have treatment, we don't have vaccine, so it's very uncertain how the next winter will unfold. And also, we have seen in the crisis incredibly increases in debt, both public sector and in the private sector. And it's unclear at this stage how this increase in debt will eventually play out going forward. Of course, we may also see positive news in the moment when we will have a treatment or a vaccine. Maybe these numbers will turn out to be much more positive again, sadly. But at the moment, these are the numbers. And the most importantly, maybe for our panel today, we see that there is big heterogeneity across countries in Europe in terms of impact of GDP, which is good on the one hand, but bad on the other, for the reason I will explain later. So for example, in Germany, the forecast of the IMF predict a reduction of almost 8%. But if we look at the three other major countries, France, Italy, and Spain, they are about 12.5 and 13. So it's quite a substantial heterogeneity, with the three other big countries almost double the German drop. And the same heterogeneity is also across sectors. We see some sectors that are hit very heavily, like transport and tourism, of course, where others instead are not hit or even have gained, for example, the technology. But overall estimates, again, of the IMF and the ECB forecast that the sectors that are most hit by the crisis correspond to about 50% of the gross added value in Europe. So you see that Europe is substantially affected by the crisis. In a heterogeneous matter, across countries, across sectors, with strong numbers, much worse than the global crisis of 2008 and 10, and even worse than the sovereign debt crisis. What have we seen from the start of the crisis in terms of policies? Well, we have seen massive policy reaction on the monetary policy on the one side, on the fiscal policy on the other. I think the IMF estimate fiscal policies for about 11 trillion in the advanced economies, which is an enormous number. The overall objective, very briefly, has been probably to try to make this crisis as temporary as possible. So try to support the income of people through subsidies, through temporary wage payments, through moratoria, and at the same time try to ease as much as possible the financing condition for the real economy, which is, of course, is the first sector, so the first part of the economy that was affected by the crisis. And here again, the policies have been moratoria to corporates, but also massively state guarantees. In Europe, and this maybe is a more of a specificity of Europe, we have seen the banks back at having a central role in the economy as the center of the intermediation chain. So banks have given credit to companies through the drawdown of credit lines, through loans with state guarantees, with moratoria to both individuals and corporates. But most importantly, they have been back at the center stage. They have been reducing market share in years before the crisis. At the crisis, because they have been somehow the economic actor, the financial actor on which governments have relied to give credit to the economy, they are back very much at the center stage. So overall, I would say, despite the big crisis, the big shock, policies have been quite successful to so far at least try to contain the crisis as much as possible and to ease conditions to the real economy. And indeed, for example, in May, we have seen a big increase in the loan to corporates, a 7.3% increase relative to previous years. So the economy is restarting, liquidity is flowing, and everything's, from this perspective, to be under control so far. Now, where do I see the major challenges going forward? I would like to distinguish three different points, which are very related. The first one is that so far, most of the help to the real economy has taken the form of debt. So liquidity has been provided through loans, basically. Going forward, I think this is important that we also think about the solvency risk of companies, because loans have dramatically increased the corporate indebtedness. And therefore, we expect bankruptcies in the corporate sectors, in particular once the moratoria will be over in the next quarters of the year. And just to give you some numbers of what we could expect going forward in Europe, with some colleagues, we have estimated the effects of 3 months lockdown in Italy on the Italian companies. And what we have found is that 3 months of lockdown, so not that much, and then the full recovery after the lockdown, would lead to about 17% of firms entering in distress. With entering in distress means having a negative book value of equity. And of this, about 18% would be small firms, a bit less medium firms, and only 6% the large companies. So you can see that the default would affect mostly the SMEs. And together, these companies would have about 800,000 employees that would count about 9% of the Italian employment. So you see also from here that should these firms enter into default, the effect on the economy would be really substantial. So corporate solvency is a challenge going forward that should be addressed very seriously. On top of it, there is also the other aspect, which is typical of Europe again, that is that fiscal policies have taken place at the national level so far, with potential uneven recovery across countries. So this is why with some of other colleagues from Frankfurt, Amsterdam, and so on, we have been proposing the creation of European Pandemic Equity Fund, basically a fund that would make an initial cash investment in return for a share in future earnings to companies and in particular to SMEs. And we can discuss more, but the point here is the importance of giving equity support or quasi-equity support to companies in order to reduce the corporate risk and the risk of bankruptcy going forward. And somehow, if we look at the recovery or the next generation plan that the Commission has put forward that is going to be decided and discussed, not decided, unfortunately, hopefully, but at least discussed at the end of this week, we see that there is a movement from Europe to create a solvency support instrument that would indeed go into the direction of addressing the equity risk or the default risk of companies. And this is very welcome, and we hope this is going to be strengthened and enlarged eventually if the need comes, but first of all, accepted, if not this week, soon enough to support the economy. Last point before I stop, the other challenge, so the first one is the solvency support of companies, the second is the risk of fragmentation, therefore the need of European solution that can sort of realign this potential fragmentation. But the last challenge in my view is the preservation of financial stability. So far we have seen companies and the real sector being the first hit by the crisis. But if we look, for example, at stock markets, the stock market take an index of the industries, this is about 6% down from the peak. If you take the index of banks, this is down about 40% from before the crisis. So why there is such a difference, and why, despite the banks not being hit directly, have suffered so much in terms of stock prices? There are many reasons for that, but one of that certainly is that this anticipate the future non-performing loans because of future default risk in the corporate sector. So whereas so far we have seen a big emphasis and a big attention on the corporate sector, first in terms of liquidity, now slowly more and more so in terms of equity support, I think it's going to be very important going forward that more attention is also given to preserve financial stability in the banking sector if we want to, at the end of the day, maintain the support to the real economy. And let me end with one data on this. So if we look at the recent European Banking Authority assessment of the impact of COVID on the European banking sector, we see that European banks have about 57% of their loan portfolio exposed to sectors that are most hit by the crisis. Of course, there is a big heterogeneity across banks and across countries. Of course, banks are enter this crisis much more strongly than the previous crisis. Their capital level, the core equity tier 1 is about 15%. In 2008, it was 7%. So you see the big increase in the solvency, or if you want, in the strength of the banks to absorb shocks. But nevertheless, 50% of exposure to sectors hit by the economy is a large number. And of course, and then the possibility that banks will see their capital levels reduce a lot is likely. And therefore, this remains, in my view, the most urgent challenge for the European economies for the recovery. Let me stop here.
Thanks very much, Elena. Can I ask you a question before you go? Just a clarifying question, actually. Charles Enoch was asking it. Talking about your equity stake idea, which I remember we covered a couple of months ago on a webinar here, didn't we? He's saying, who takes this equity stake? Is it a European institution, national government? Who's making that investment?
So in our view, it would be the public sector. So basically, the idea would be to give it to either the European Investment Fund or the European Investment Bank, some funds that then they could invest in equity. But nothing precludes maybe in a second wave or even initially, and this is also in line with the solvency support instrument of the Commission that the private sector comes in. For example, think of insurance companies or pension funds that could also contribute to providing equity to SMEs. But we see the public sector has been essential to start somehow the programs of this sort.
And to finish off, that idea really is getting traction now in Europe.
Yes, this idea is taking traction. I was actually participating last week in a webinar with the European Investment Fund on the solvency support instrument. So the Commission is proposing to provide equity to companies. It's unclear at this stage what form of equity they have in mind. We had in mind something very, very easy, something very simple. That means cash against the sharing of future revenues, so that there would be no dilution of existing shareholders, no governance power of any form. So in a way, quasi-equity. I think the Commission will go for a broader range of equity instruments, but certainly the recognition of the solvency risk of companies and therefore of the need to provide equity support is there. For corporate is there. It's for banks that we are not there yet.
Well, it's very interesting to see something move from idea to policy proposal to something real within a matter of weeks at the moment. Just shows how deep this crisis has been. Elena, thank you very much. We'll have you back in a little while when the rest of the panel has spoken, because we've got lots of questions coming in. But first of all, I'd like to move on to Randy, who's going to be covering the United States for us. Randy, up to you.
All right, thank you very much. Delighted to be with you, and delighted to be working with CEPR in this joint workshop. So certainly, I mean, many of the challenges and many of the responses are similar in the U.S. and in Europe. I don't want to go through the details of all of the responses. And a very sharp response both on the fiscal side and the monetary side. I think one of the things that was seen as very surprising in the response in the US was the speed with which a very partisan Congress was able to respond with a series of bills that are spending roughly 15% of US GDP and get that through in a very short period of time. The Fed raised up some of the programs that, well, I think all of the programs that were there when I was there a decade ago, plus a number of new programs to do a broader set of asset purchases going into municipalities and going into lower grade corporate debt, going into some direct lending, so a variety of things that go much further than we had before. Part of that is because of the Treasury providing, well, actually the Congress providing money to the Treasury to provide effectively a first loss for the Fed programs. The Fed programs are ones in which they're using the Fed's emergency powers, the so-called 13(3) powers that came from the amendments in the 1930s, to be able to lend against good collateral in unusual and exigent circumstances. The reason that the money from the taxpayer through the Congress, the Treasury, is so important is that puts the taxpayer in the first loss position. That doesn't put so that takes the Fed away from being in the first loss position. Ultimately, of course, always that is to the taxpayer, but because of the way the powers, the emergency powers work, the Fed can lend only against good collateral. Well, if you're lending only against good collateral in a crisis, there may not be a lot of very good collateral available. If, however, there's money coming in from the taxpayer to be in a first loss position, then being able to lend to lower grade corporates, lend to municipalities with lower credit ratings, being able to take on more risk is possible because more collateral is being provided. And I think that's sort of an interesting change that has occurred since the last crisis. And interestingly, I think it's come because of some of the reforms in Dodd-Frank. So most central bankers are very concerned after Dodd-Frank that, well, one of the things that Dodd-Frank did is take away a number of the emergency powers. The things that were done when I was there, we did not have to coordinate with the Treasury Department. We could do what 5 governors or more, which was that meant unanimity at the time that I was there, because we either had 4 or 5 governors voting, that we could act. There was a concern that the Fed couldn't act swiftly, couldn't act boldly if it had to get a sign off from the Treasury first. Interestingly, what's happened is that precisely because of that, the Congress appropriated money to the Treasury to then work closely with the Fed on this. And it'll be interesting, so that which has allowed the Fed to go further out on the risk curve. It'll be interesting to see, however, since it is going out further on the risk curve, there may be some losses this time. There were no losses associated with the programs last time, and that may create a very different political situation. But going forward, rather than focus on more Fed policies or more traditional fiscal policies, and there's certainly been a lot of concerns about the fiscal deficit, I want to focus on the data deficit, because I think this is really the crucial thing that we should have been doing earlier, we should be doing now, and super important going forward, because with more data, we can save lives and we can save livelihood. It's just a more effective risk management strategy that I don't think costs a lot of GDP, but has an enormous payoff for both lives and livelihoods. We can see that when we don't have a lot of information, we respond in a very blunt way. As we respond with a general lockdown of the economy. Without much information, that may not be a crazy response, but obviously an incredibly costly response. Also, without information, a lot of fear is generated. And we know that from a number of studies from my colleagues at University of Chicago, as well as elsewhere, that people started changing their behavior before lockdowns occurred. They were afraid to go out. They were afraid to go to the office. And so consumption patterns changed dramatically. Transportation patterns changed dramatically prior to the lockdowns. And as the lockdowns are coming off, we're not seeing just a snap back to where we were. We're not seeing a V. We're seeing a rapid movement off of the bottom, but in many sectors that had gone down nearly to zero. So you're going to see a high growth rate, but you're not going to see a restoration back to anything close to where we were in many sectors. And we're going to continue to get some of these flare-ups as we go along. Many people that use the analogy of a flu, and we know that flus typically go away in the summertime. Well, we continue to see flare-ups of this. So I think the flu analogy is not a good one. I think it's better to think of it more as a fire, like a forest fire, where the lockdown was an attempt to take the air out of the fire, and that has helped to reduce the intensity of the flames, but there's still some of the trees that are burning. And there are breezes that come that bring some of those hot embers elsewhere into the forest. We can think about places where super spreading type events that might be in meatpacking plants, might be in other places where there are a lot of people in close contact, either speaking loudly or a lot of potential for virus transmission as being like tinder. And so if one of those embers gets into that tinder, you get a flare up. And we're going to continue to see that, or at least from my perspective, I think that's a much better way to think about it, rather than to think about it simply as waves. It's going to be something that's continuing on. You're going to continue to get those flare ups. And that's why data is so important. And it's been something that's very much been neglected. As I mentioned, the US has spent, and many countries have spent, on the order of 10 to 20% of GDP, largely through support programs. Incredibly important to provide support to families, households, and to try to avoid financial crisis, exactly as Elena had said. Super important to do that, and a lot of the Fed programs were focused on that. And I think as the markets were crashing, the Fed's intervention helped to take out what I call the market dysfunction discount, that people were dumping securities because they thought, oh my goodness, if even the US Treasury security market is not working that well, I'm worried about being able to get out. If I can't get out, if I'm having trouble getting out now, things could only get worse. So I'm just going to dump now. So by saying no, the Fed is aware of these challenges, is going to provide liquidity to the system, is going to provide the swap arrangements, provide dollar liquidity around the world. That's going to take out that market dysfunction discount and bring security prices back up, which I think was certainly important. And so the Fed has done that. many of the policies have helped to provide support for households during this time, but that's just been focused on the hope that we'll just get back to where we were and that the virus will go away. But my view is the virus is not going away, anytime soon, and certainly we don't have a vaccine on the horizon, and if there were one, it's going to take a long time to get literally billions of doses out to people to make people feel confident to get out again. And so I think the key thing to focus on would be data. Getting the right information, the right data out there, collecting the right data, and using that for testing, for providing better understanding of the course of the virus, providing better information for thinking about ways to mitigate the mortality of the virus, and a whole variety of things. But it's gotten very little funding. Of those bills that the Congress passed, spending about $3 trillion, no more than 8% could be broadly construed as being about testing, about being personal protective equipment, about treatments, vaccines, contact tracing. And in the new bill that was proposed but didn't move ahead, just most recently, it was less than 3% of the appropriations would have been for that. But I think it's crucial to have this data for both for the substantive reasons for mitigating the impact on people's lives, but also on livelihoods, as well as more broadly on credibility. Because I think back to when I worked in the White House previously, before being at the Fed, I was there during 9/11. We had a shock, an incredible tragedy and shock, which shut down the air transportation industry. People were very much afraid to fly, much like people are very much afraid to go out now. How did we restore confidence in the air transportation industry? We did not say that air transportation is perfectly safe. There'll never be another terrorist incident again. What we said is we'll do our best. And here are particular things that we are doing that were very easy to observe and built up credibility. Cockpit door locks, increased screening, the 100 milliliter bottle maxima. We can debate how effective they are in preventing another terrorist event, but they're very clear signals to people that a substantive change has been taken. We're taking this seriously, and so we're saying that you can go back to fly, and we're making it credible to you that you can go back to fly. Without the analogy here is with data. Without the information about where outbreaks are happening, without good information about fatality rates, whole variety of things about the virus, it's very hard to be credible to people, tell them, oh, go back out, it's okay. And so I think it's extraordinarily important, and it just is a much more sensible risk management approach to take at the moment to try to focus on this. And I think there are a number of pieces that we want to focus on. First is the data collection, the simple stuff on cases and deaths. There's not consistency in the way that it's reported even within the U.S., and we need that consistency not only within the U.S. but globally. Clearer guidance coming out and ways of both getting the private sector as well as public sector on board with following that kind of guidance. Second is speed of reporting. The tinder can explode into flames very quickly, and so you want to be able to know where the fire is, to be able to get the equipment there as quickly as possible. So building a real-time reporting system is extraordinarily important. And you want data, you want information with that, you want more detail, but you don't want so much more detail that it slows it down. So you need some basics like age, race, gender, ethnicity, zip code. We'd love to have more, but that can come subsequently or with more detailed studies. But we need to get this kind of data out quickly to be able to address these issues. We're seeing this throughout the U.S. right now. We're seeing this in the UK and elsewhere with these lags of data about where things are happening. That's problematic because this virus will move very quickly, and so a few days makes an enormous difference. Second piece is randomized testing. This is something that we've done very little of in the US, but is something that the most recent Nobel Prize winners, Banerjee, Duflo, and Kramer, in part won their prize for, because they were doing randomized control testing on a whole variety of things. One of the classic examples they used is, thinking about disease prevalence in emerging market countries. Previously, people were estimating prevalence off of the frequency, the data of people who are coming to these rural clinics. Well, who's coming to the rural clinics? People who are ill. So it becomes very difficult to estimate what the prevalence is. The same thing now, it's very difficult to estimate how many people have been infected, to estimate to get proper estimates of fatality rates if you're only seeing a very selected sample. Louis Capello used a wonderful example in the New York Times. He said, if you're trying to estimate what are the proportion of Trump voters in the economy, you don't go to a Trump rally and ask, do you support Trump? And then generalize that to the population. That's a classic selection mechanism. That's the kind of selection mechanisms we've had. It's completely feasible to do randomized testing. The Germans have done this, exactly as Elena mentioned. I think they've gotten a lot of things right there. They are doing randomized testing going forward, following thousands of households to understand the evolution of the disease. They're also doing this with blood banks. This is relatively low cost and relatively easy to do. Will give us an enormous amount of data going forward about the prevalence of the disease, and also confidence that people know where the disease is, where the disease isn't. Second, you can also use this randomized testing for trying to understand better how we can develop new therapies. So much focus has been on a vaccine, but we've never had a vaccine developed against a coronavirus, SARS, MERS, and many other viruses like HIV/AIDS. That has been around for a long time. Billions of dollars have been spent on that. Millions of lives have been lost. We still don't have a vaccine against that. But you can get mitigants. How do you figure out quickly what those mitigants are? Again, randomized testing. Here in the UK, there's something called Recovery, which is a randomized evaluation of COVID therapies, where they use multiple, they're trying multiple different possibilities of different treatments against a common placebo. So you can basically do 5 different tests at the same time, much more effectively. Collect the data quickly, and then get the information out. And a lot of the recent information that we have about use of steroids and such is coming from that kind of experiment. Pool testing can also be very, very valuable. When the prevalence of the disease is low, instead of testing each person and doing a test individually on people, you do groups of 10. And since the prevalence is low, if you don't find anything in that 10, you can just do one quick test on that 10. If nothing, you move on. If you find that there was potential for disease, you go back and do more detailed testing on those people. This is a relatively low-cost way to do much wider testing. Also, we need to drop some of the obstacles that we have to broader testing being used at universities and other places that have the competence to do this, but the CDC hasn't gone forward with it. So bottom line for policy is we need to have much better risk management. We're thinking about addressing the disease. Obviously, traditional fiscal and monetary policy are extraordinarily important, as Elena had outlined, but I think we need to focus on the data and focus on testing. More resources that go into this, focus on randomized controlled trials, clear guidance for what data should be reported, real-time reporting and building that system, the contact tracing that comes with that, focus on prophylactics and mitigants, not just on the vaccine. If we can bend the fatality curve, that's extraordinarily important. If we can make this disease something that is no more than a traditional flu or a traditional cold, and that may be possible to move the needle on that, that's extraordinarily important in getting people on board with these sorts of things. So it's really better risk management for building credibility, and we can save lives and save livelihoods by closing the data deficit.
Randy, thanks ever so much. I'm going to ask you a question with a one-sentence answer, if you will. Are you also in favor of more real-time, rapid economic data as well as pandemic data?
That would be great to have that too. And we have some of that through the cell phones and mobility data. I think that's a good way of getting real-time data.
Great. I'm gonna move on now because we've got lots of questions building up, and we need to hear from Hyun. So thank you very much for that. And Hyun, please, if you could talk to us a little bit about what's going on in Asia.
Thanks, Tim. One of the advantages of going last is that I can be short. Many of the important points have already been covered. I'll broaden the focus a bit to emerging markets more broadly. One thing that Randy mentioned, which I think is very important, is the importance of fiscal space going forward. We thought that at one point, I think the optimistic scenario was that this would be a short-lived shock. We can just go into suspended animation, just stop the clock, and then emerge, rubbing our eyes back into the sun. It doesn't look it doesn't look as if that's going to be feasible, and the virus is going to be with us for a while. And fiscal policy, I think, has been really the the mainstay of the policy response, together with the central banks. But I think perhaps a welcome surprise this time around has been how fast the fiscal authorities have been able to move. Randy mentioned some numbers for the US. In the advanced economies as a whole, the fiscal packages announced in the last few months has been of the order of 10% of GDP in terms of the budgetary measures, and another 12% of GDP in terms of guarantees and funding. It's much less in the emerging markets, around 3%, plus another 3% in guarantees, and I'll come back to that later. But these were meant to be a kind of a stopgap while we emerge from the initial shock. And the rationale here is that we want to flatten the mortality curve for businesses as well as flatten the mortality curve for individuals. In that there will be in that we want to make sure that the interconnecting relationships that sustain the economy, the fabric of the economy, if you like, are maintained rather than being dissolved, so that we can emerge from the shock much more rapidly. Now, there will come a time when we need to sift through the businesses to make sure that those businesses that are unviable, can be resolved. But what we want to avoid is doing this in an indiscriminate way when financial conditions are very tight, when you're going to be sweeping together viable and unviable businesses, and that's going to be very, very costly for society. So that was the the rationale for the fiscal response. Now, if we believe that there'll be a second wave, if we believe that the virus will linger, and given the nature of the epidemiology, as long as there is one corner of the world where the virus is, has a strong foothold, it's going to be difficult to sort of declare victory. There will always be the potential for a wider flare-up. I think when we look at the policy response, and I think this is where emerging markets have been particularly hard hit. Emerging markets haven't been able to muster the same kind of fiscal response as in the advanced economies. It's more like 3% of GDP in budgetary responses, another 3% in terms of guarantees and funding. That's less than a third of what the advanced economies have been able to do. And the one hypothesis for why this is the case is that there is much less fiscal space for emerging markets. And the way to think about this is when you're trying to mobilize resources for a fiscal response, you can, the size is too big to use the kind of usual sort of tax, the taxation route. You have to borrow in some way. You can either borrow conventionally in the bond market, or you can try monetary financing, which I'll get to shortly. In emerging markets, monetary financing has almost invariably led to very bad outcomes. And so the bond financing has been the preferred route. But what we saw in March was a fairly short-lived, but a very sharp period of stress in the local currency government bond market. And now things have normalized, now things have come back to something, it's not quite back to the pre-pandemic spreads, but it's something like so halfway towards the spreads seen before the shock. But the question is, how much appetite is there for additional local currency government bonds that can come on the market that you can use to then mobilize the resources domestically? And here there is a very long tradition in emerging markets where the conventional wisdom has been that emerging market borrowers have to rely on foreign currency borrowing in order to borrow from external investors. But I think one of the really remarkable developments in the last 20 years after the emerging market crises of the 1990s is that emerging market governments, at least, so the sovereign bond market has now gone almost exclusively to a local currency market. So emerging market governments, especially those those middle-income countries that were at the heart of the emerging market crises of the 1990s, have well and truly overcome original sin, so-called, the idea that emerging markets can only borrow from foreigners in foreign currency. They've well and truly overcome that, and they are now borrowing almost exclusively in domestic currency. But the problem is that the investor community is also, it also needs to hedge its risk, and they tend to come into emerging market sovereign bonds on an unhedged basis. So rather than using hedging instruments to invest on a pre-hedged basis, it's been very much treated as a marginal investment where you go in and you take the currency risk so that the currency risk can amplify the gains and losses on the underlying fixed income instruments. So you tend to see that emerging market currencies strengthen when there are capital inflows and when the yields fall, which tend to amplify the gains. But then the downside is that there is also an amplification of the losses. But I think going forward, I think one of the big questions that we should be having at the front of our minds is, where do we get the additional fiscal space? And this is true not only in emerging markets, but also in the advanced economies, but it's especially acute in emerging markets, given now that COVID-19 is hitting Latin America particularly hard. The fiscal response has to be there. It's been somewhat muted compared to advanced economies so far. And I think that question really should be at the front and center of attention. One very hopeful sign, and I think this is something that we can go back to, is that the crisis response in March from emerging market central banks has really departed from the usual playbook, where typically when emerging markets come under pressure, central banks would raise interest rates very sharply in order to arrest the depreciation of the currency, and thereby exacerbate the tightening of financial conditions domestically. This time around, the response has been really, quite the opposite. The emerging market central banks have loosened monetary policy. They've cut rates, and they've also intervened in the local currency bond markets and intervened directly by purchasing bonds. It's not quite the size that would emulate quantitative easing. So there are much smaller quantities, but it's really been an unprecedented change in the playbook. And I think if we can find ways where we can build on that initial very promising policy response, first of all, to maintain financial stability while being able to secure more fiscal space, as well as to encourage global investors to think about entering emerging markets on a hedged basis. So on entering investments in emerging market sovereign bonds, by simultaneously entering into a swap arrangement or otherwise through the futures market or some kind of forward contract, in order that they don't have to sell when when the time turns. So I think this is still, something that that needs to be fully addressed. So let me conclude there, Tim, for the initial round, and we can perhaps collect some reactions.
Yes, that's great. Thank you. Can I ask you a question first of all, though? Nicolas asked it. He says, do you think that the multilateral financial institutions lack the capacity to provide support for large emerging market economies if a solvency crisis arise?
I think it's, yes, I think there is a lack of capacity. The increasing the firepower of the IMF and the other multilateral agencies, I think, has been on the agenda for a while. But I think there's also room for the private sector as well. There is a room for capital markets and private investors also. I think if we think about the way that emerging markets have graduated from original sin, it's been really one of the remarkable developments. It's something that we should really celebrate and really build on. And to that extent, I think the multilateral bodies clearly have a role, but gaining and maintaining access to capital markets will clearly need to be a very important part of any response.
Now, thanks everybody. I'm going to bundle 3 questions together and give you the option to answer some or all of them, but I'm going to have to ask you to be quite quick. So I will come to Elena first of all. Your 3 questions, one from Catherine Mann, who's saying, could you compare the short-term life preserver versus medium-term stimulus, including the catalyst for business investment, the balance of that in your region? Then Lorenzo's asking, can we design financing mechanisms to ensure a transition to climate smart and circular economy sort of investment post-crisis? And also Bernard Casey he wants to know which letter of the alphabet that you think the recovery is going to be. V, U, W, L, K. He says K. I didn't know there even was a K.
Yeah,
anyway, Elena.
Kroszner.
Yeah, I also didn't know there was a K. I was actually very surprised.
I'm trying to
when
think
I
what
saw
that would
it in
be,
the
actually.
question.
Yes, yeah.
Exactly. Well, I think it's fair to say by now that the V shape. Let me start with this question. So I think it's fair to say that by now the V shape is out of the picture. I think this was somehow the wishful thinking that we all had at the beginning. As Hyun said, we hope this was very temporary. I think now we are probably in the U shape. Hopefully it will not be a W. So hopefully it will be rather a double V, but not a W, because this would be the most, of course, the most dramatic. In terms of climate and green, I think crises are also an opportunity. So we should exploit these opportunities. And if we think, for example, of Europe, the Next Generation Plan has clearly a big emphasis on the Green Deal and the completion towards, the transition towards a more, let's say, green and climate-friendly economy. So this is possibly one aspect that we will be gaining probably from the crisis, because there is an industrial rethinking, and in doing it, we can put more emphasis on these type of things. In terms of short-term versus medium-term, I think so far we are still in the short-term size of the policy responses, if I understood the question of Karin correctly. So I think a medium-term, we should still wait a little bit to see the policy responses. As I was saying, in Europe at least, so far, there has been a balanced policy response, I think. And as Hyun said, of course, the fiscal space and fiscal policy was a master in terms of responses. Of course, here we also have a problem on fiscal space. It's important, for example, to see Italy, of course, is the most problematic. But I think Europe is moving in the direction of trying to create a more fiscal space also for the weaker countries. Let's hope that they will manage to do it.
Randy, for you.
And so I already said that I didn't think it was going to be a V, and hopefully we can keep it in a U and not a W, but I am concerned that if we continue to get these flare-ups and then responses with both lockdowns and behavioral responses, that could lead us into a W type of pattern, which I agree with Elena would be quite problematic. I think that it is extraordinarily important to move from the first stage of responses, which were really the ones based on a V-shaped recovery, that we just freeze everything, we give people support for a month or two, and then as long as they can make it through that month or two, we turn the lights off, we turn the lights back on, and we're fine. I think the impact on the economy is much more fundamental than that. I think it's more fundamental than after 9/11. Because I think the behavior response is going to be longer. I think it's more fundamental than the financial crisis, which really led to a shrinking of the housing sector and the financial sector, but didn't lead to a broader change in the overall structure of the economy. I think this is a bigger structural change, and we have to accept that. And what that means is thinking about restructuring policies. So whether it's the kind of capital, the equity investment that Elena has put forward, a more expedited bankruptcy system, potentially having central banks provide more support for debtor in possession financing to be able to get through that, be prepared for that so it doesn't just hit us suddenly and we go, well, what do we do? But be prepared for that, because it'll help to prevent a financial crisis and actually help to move resources in the system more quickly. I think that's important. And the third question was?
Climate.
Green recovery, I believe.
Green recovery. And so one of the areas, particularly in the US, where there's just been an enormous amount of very highly leveraged finance was in shale oil. And so that is an area where there's going to be an enormous amount of restructuring that occurs. Obviously, there's a dramatic change in the price of energy, and that's likely to be with us for quite some time. And so as part of that restructuring, if you could then do something with either the way it's restructured, setting up perhaps an asset management company that would have particular approaches to how this industry then comes out, or providing particular incentives. You have an opportunity here to restructure a significant part of the energy industry in the US and perhaps get it focused in a different direction.
Thanks very much. Hyun, you finish us off.
On the shape of the recovery, even in the optimistic scenario, I think we have to take into account the various interconnections in the global economy and the non-synchronous way in which the pandemic would hit particular regions. So even if the wave were a single wave, if you run these shocks through a standard time series model, what you see is that there's a very persistent effect. And we published a bulletin about this sometime in April. But the shape of the recovery certainly will depend on the course of the pandemic. If we have a second wave, or if there is a lingering of the first wave, then I think it's a much less sort of optimistic scenario where this optimistic view that we can just stop the clock for a few weeks and then emerge clearly will not hold. Behavior has changed. Behavior will change further. And the issue of fiscal space really looms large in that case. We designed the fiscal packages. They were very welcome. They were very aggressive, unprecedented, very large. But they were designed for a very short and sharp shock. If the economy continues to be depressed, then I think we will need to dip in further. And the question then is, how will the financial markets absorb? And then it becomes a much broader issue. Everyone will need to think very hard about that. I think, so let me just stop there, Tim.
All right, thank you very much. Yes, we have to stop there, and everyone has to stop there, I'm afraid. We've run out of time. We've got some questions that haven't been answered. Actually, Elena, there's a couple that might be good for you to answer offline because they're particularly about the equity investment. So
I will, with pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all your questions. Thank you to the panelists. We have an urgent issue of clarification. Bernard's been back on to us to tell us what a K-shaped recovery looks like. It goes up for some people and down for others. Once you know it, you do it. And he also speculates that there might be a saw blade recovery. Please no, or else, yeah, please.
As long as it's upward sloping, Tim.
Okay, thank you very much, all of you. Thank you, panel. Now, that's, as I said, that's all we have time for, but keep following the CEPR's COVID-19 coverage, especially in COVID economics, which is now up to issue 36, publishing new research on COVID-19. And we do that by cutting down the normal 3-year approval process by 2 years and 51 weeks, really. And but there is some remarkable research in there, and it keeps on coming. Thank you for everyone who's contributed to that. But meanwhile, I have to say goodbye from the CEPR, from Beatrice, and from myself, Tim Phillips, and from our panel. Please, as I always say at this time, stay positive by staying negative. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.